מה העניינים דפנה?
היי, מה העניינים?
מה, הגעתי ישר מהמאמר שלכם לכאן?
כן, קיפצתי מריבוע לריבוע.
האמת שבדיוק יצא לי להתייחס אליו.
רגע, למה אני לא שומעת טוב? שנייה, אני מנסה לסדר פה את הטכנולוגיה.
שומעים אותי?
אני שומעת.
שלום לך.
שלום, שלום. למה צריכה לפתוח את המצלמה משום מה?
זה בגלל שאת בצלב האדום והכל סודי.
ממש. אל תשאלי איזה סודיות. מה המצב בקנדה?
קפוא ביותר.
וואו.
קפוא וגם סגור ביותר. הם בעוד סגר פה.
זהו, רציתי לשאול מה עם האומיקרון.
פשוט סגרו הכל. גנים, בתי ספר, בלי למצמץ בכלל. אין יותר.
יואו. מטורף.
ממש מטורף. כאילו שנה שלישית שהם סוגרים.
יואו.
היי טל.
היי, ברכות על הצגת המאמר, הקשבתי, מאוד מעניין.
תודה.
אהלן יהלי. עוברים מזכויות אדם ישר למלחמה.
למה? גם אנחנו זכויות אדם.
כן, כן. צודק. זכויות אדם in military settings.
כן, לא, הספר עצמו הוא AI and Human Rights.
כן.
אנחנו הכי פחות Human Rights בתוך הספר.
כן. זה גם CCDCOE?
מה?
זה קבוצת עבודה של נאטו או שזה פרויקט אחר?
לא, לא. זה...
ספר אקדמי גרידא?
אני לא זוכר, תמיד אני לא זוכר אם זה אוקספורד או קיימברידג' Handbook on AI and Human Rights.
שלום דוד, כיף שהצטרפת.
שלום.
היי היי.
היי.
יש לנו שני דוידים שהצטרפו אלינו, גם דוד לוי פאור וגם דוד קרצ'מר. שלום לשניכם.
תודה, שלום דוד קרצ'מר.
שלום דוד, מה שלומך?
בסדר, לא רחוק ממך.
כן? איפה אתה עכשיו?
אני בבקה.
בבקה, כן, טוב.
מרחק הליכה.
כן, בהחלט.
יובל?
אהלן.
אלן, אני יכול לשתף מסך?
כן, בטח. היי אמיר, מה שלומך?
בדיוק התחלתי לשלוף את האילוסטרציה. ברשותכם אני אחזור למיוט עכשיו.
רגע, אבל בעזרת נגיד לך מזל טוב. לאמיר נולדה בת.
בדיוק.
כן, תודה.
וגם ציטטו את המחקר שלו בעליון.
דייב, היי.
היי יובל, מה נשמע?
אני הרגע הבנתי שאני שלח לך את המאמר הלא נכון, כי נתתי סמינר מחלקתי על מאמר אחר.
זה בדיוק. נכון, והם לא שלחו לי הודעה על הסמינר הזה, לא קיבלתי את המאמר, רציתי אותו, לא קיבלתי אותו, לא נכנסתי.
בסדר, אוקיי. כי עכשיו זה פייפר שלי עם יאלי, זה משהו אחר. זה לא מה ששלחתי לך.
אני הבנתי שזה משהו אחר, רציתי לקבל את האור.
אוקיי, סבבה. טוב. כן, זה באמת סיטואציה remarkable שיש שתי פרזנטציות באותו יום בעולם הקטן שלנו.
אוקיי. היי סדריק, מה שלומך? כיף שהצטרפת אלינו.
היי.
Okay, so hello everyone. Without any further ado, we'll begin with our last session of the workshop for this semester. Today we have the presentation by our very own director, Yuval Shany, and Yahli Shereshevski, also our very own, which we also share with Haifa University, starting from the recent academic year. So
what's with your cat? What's happening with your cat?
Every time I say Yuval, he wakes up. So without further ado, the floor is yours, and I will give some attention to my cat.
Okay, so hi everyone, it's great to be here, and we will present the draft chapter that Yuval and myself wrote on AI in military settings. The chapter will appear in the Handbook on AI and Human Rights. I will start with a brief description of the structure of the paper, and Yuval will continue to discuss in more detail two key aspects of military AI, which is the notion of meaningful human control and responsibility for violations of the law in the context of military AI. So the first part of our paper describes the contemporary use of military AI, and in addition, the contemporary attempts to regulate such uses under international law. The discussion of military AI often focuses on autonomous weapons that received the awful name laws recently, but AI has various uses in military settings other than autonomous weapons. It's a decision-making enabling technology that has potential implications for almost every aspect of the military, including strategic planning, intelligence gathering, organization of logistics, weapon deployment, personnel management, law enforcement, as well as targeting decisions. We offer in the chapter a short description of some of the principal existing uses of AI in military settings, and we suggest that these aspects should receive more attention in scholarship beyond the vast discussion of autonomous weapons. The second part of the background addresses attempts to regulate AI in military settings. We describe the lack of formal rules that address military AI, and this is a common problem in the regulation of contemporary IHL, right? The norms were created decades ago, and there is a general agreement that the prospects of formal regulation is very low. In fact, we received an example for the low prospect of formal regulation just last week, when there was an enormous failure to the attempt to ban autonomous weapons at the CCW review conference, and there are lots of reaction if you follow international Twitter on the events last week. So in the absence of specific formal regulation on the use of military AI, lawmakers have started to explore informal regulatory avenues. And these avenues are taken by states and non-state actors, and through these informal processes, they try to influence the governing normative framework on military AI. And this is done primarily through the work of the CCW group of governmental experts on emerging technologies in the area of lethal autonomous weapons, known as the GGE laws, and through other informal processes. And these efforts focus primarily on the regulation of autonomous weapons, and unlike the autonomous weapons, the regulation of other applications of AI technologies in the military does not receive significant regulatory attention at all. The heart of our chapter explores several key questions regarding the regulation of AI in military settings. The first is the question of evolution or revolution. A significant part of the ongoing debate over the regulation of AI in military settings focuses on this question, right? Does resort to AI fundamentally change the manner of application of IHL and IHRL, or is it possible to apply traditional understandings of these legal regimes to this new technology? While some states and non-state actors emphasize the capacity of the current legal framework to effectively regulate AI, other actors insist on the need to develop new rules. And we discuss this issue both regarding the desirability of creating new rules and the realpolitik discussion about the feasibility of forming international agreements around these issues and the likelihood or the potential that such new rules would constitute a satisfactory regulatory framework given the highly polarized nature of the politics surrounding lawmaking in this area of international law. Yuval just came here from presenting a paper with Daphna that addresses other aspects of new technologies. And in this sense, right, they raise in the paper the two avenues for new regulation, right? You can think about creating new treaties, but also it's possible to offer radical interpretations of existing norms to address these new developments. And following the last slide with suggesting that the prospect of creating new norms is very low, then the most reasonable avenue for change, even if you think about the need for a revolution, through radical interpretation of existing laws rather than the creation of new treaties. The second question that we explore is the co-application of IHL and IHRL in the context of military AI. And this is a preliminary question that is relevant to the international analysis of the use of AI, and the book that this chapter appears in addresses is the handbook on AI and human rights. However, chapter focuses mainly on IHL, and this is because while there is a general agreement regarding the co-application of these two bodies of law, at least when it comes to the context of autonomous weapons, IHL seems to have primary role in assessing the ability of these weapons to comply with weapon development and conduct of hostilities norms. Human rights in the context of military AIs have more room regarding other legal questions, mainly questions relating to privacy and data protection in the context of military AI. The third issue that we address is meaningful human control. This is a key notion found in most heated discussions about AI military settings. It reflects the normative expectation that decisions potentially leading to the provision of human lives or harm to other basic human rights will be taken by human beings. This is one of the unique aspects of the discussion over military AI, and Yuval will discuss it in further detail later on, so let me stop here. The fourth issue that our chapter addresses is another key issue that is closely related to meaningful human control and also takes a large part of the debate about AI military settings, and this is responsibility for violations of international law by military AI. And here again, this is another issue that Yuval will address soon, so let me move forward. The final issue that we address is how AI changes the balance of powers between the parties to the conflict and what are the legal implications for this change. And this issue, which is common to many emerging military technologies, acknowledges the unequal global distribution of military technology. And the chapter explores the relationship between law and equality in war, and specifically in the context of AI, And while it presents and addresses the important concerns in this regard, including, for example, the potential effect of remoteness in attacks and the non-human factor in war as an incentive for powerful states to use force more easily, and subjecting their soldiers to less risk, it also acknowledges the ability of AI to improve the level of protection afforded to victims of war, and thus, at least potentially, to improve the situation of weaker parties to conflicts. So thanks again, and Yuval will now address in detail the two key issues regarding AI military settings, and I really look forward to hear your questions.
Thank you, Yahli, and thank you, Tal, for convening this, and thanks all participants. And indeed, I will delve on the two issues which are probably the most contested issues concerning the use of military AI, and that is the notion of meaningful human control and the notion of responsibility or accountability. And this is where you do have very different positions by different stakeholders. So as Yahli explained with regard to meaningful human control, the starting point of this discussion is that there is a strong expectation among many participants in the debate that human beings will take important decisions which affect other human beings. And this proposition is based on a strong ethical moral intuition or ethical imperative that human beings will assume the responsibility, have to assume responsibility for consequential acts or omission. So it derives first from a moral proposition about how decisions that affect humans should be taken and by whom. But it also, the discussion also revolves around more, let's say, empirical aspects, and that is the question of who is a better decision maker, whether AI is a sufficiently suitable decision maker in matters that may eventually involve life or death decisions. And the two sets of specific concerns we have in that regard is that many people involved in the debate do question the ability of machines to understand nuance and to understand context. And this is one set of objections to delegating decision-making power to machines in and around the battlefield. And the second aspect is that human beings, unlike machines, do tend to demonstrate compassion and sympathy, and for these reasons, it is posited that the decisions concerning important matters in and around the battlefield should continue to be taken by human beings. Now, with this, whereas we do not dispute the first issue, which is quite important as a moral proposition, we do have some doubts about the second proposition, the empirical one. And as explained immediately, also have some doubts, not as to the first proposition, not as to the propriety of that proposition, but whether it is actually implemented even now. So with regard to the empirical issue, I think the question that machines are suboptimal decision makers is something which can be questioned, and it will continue to be questioned into the future the better machines get, because machines are suboptimal in some respects, but they outdo human beings in other respects. So they can take faster decisions, they can process more data at a shorter time, they can have a superior sensory capability. They're not subject to fear, they're not subject to anger, they're not motivated by revenge. They can assume self-risks that the individuals do not. So the question, so the proposition that machines are actually worse decision makers than humans is very much questionable. Even now, and probably will be more questionable going forward. Even with regard to sympathy and compassion, it's an important point, because the machines, of course, cannot feel sympathy and cannot feel compassion, but they can replicate decisions that human beings have taken or will take. So as long as the training data, namely the set of cases that is presented by to machines, accurately reflects the ways in which human beings are actually conducting themselves, there is no reason to believe that in the long run, machines would not be able to simulate and outperform eventually human beings. So I think that the doubts surrounding the second proposition, okay, so the doubts surrounding the second proposition are also, I think, related, compounded by the doubts concerning the first proposition, because what is meaningful human control is something which is actually quite hard to pin down, and I think so even if we do require a system which has what is called man in the loop or man on the loop, so there cannot be a decision-making process that does not involve at some important stage of the process a human being, either as a decision maker or as sort of someone who conducts oversight and can actually step in and intervene. There is again an empirical set of questions about whether humans have enough information, whether they have enough understanding of how machines actually work. Do they have insights into the AI black box? Do they have the professional confidence to overrule the machine? Do they have the decision-making independence to overrule the machines? Do they operate in an organizational culture that actually tolerates decisions that go against recommendations which are made by machine? And the reason why we raise this issue is that we doubt whether even existing decision-making processes that involve data and involve recommendations by machines, whether they do fully capture the moral insight about individuals actually making fully informed decisions about other individuals. So you have doubts about who's the better decision maker, and you have doubts whether once you introduce significant amount of data into the decision-making process and machines, whether individuals do retain their independence in meaningful ways. Now, I think that both sets of doubts about what is it that we have and where are we headed explains why the GGE in the guiding principles took a very watered down standard with regard to meaningful human control. Even the term meaningful human control has not been adopted in the guiding principles. What we do have instead is a paragraph which talks about human-machine interaction, which should ensure applicability of international law standards, and that a range of factors should be considered in the evaluation of this relationship between human and machine. So we do have disagreements about what is the right thing to do and where we currently at in terms of control, which translates itself also into very open-ended language about control. Now, what we do accept is that perhaps the way forward on this set of issues would be to provide more information about the decision-making process. So we think notions such as which emanate from transparency, which relate to explainability and traceability. So understanding why machines do what they do, and understanding how does the decision-making process take place and what is the actual role of human beings in that process. These actually could be valuable valuable ways forward, which would also enable us to eventually assess the legality of introducing and deploying AI in specific military contexts. Of course, what Yahli said before about the fact that we do have regulation for, we do have a debate about lethal autonomous weapons, and we almost have no debate about other weapon systems which are controlled by machines, applies here as well. So the meaningful human control dimension is very much, I mean, the discussion is very much focused on laws. It's much less focused on other aspects, which I would argue would generate path dependencies for human beings anyway. So I would argue that the fighter pilot that is firing a missile doesn't really exercise very broad discretion or really assumes the full moral responsibility for the decision, because he or she simply do not have the data or the information that enables them to evaluate independently the data. Now, the other thorny question, which as Yahli indicated is very much related to meaningful human control, is the issue of accountability, which is also something that the guiding principles refer to in a very open-ended way. They indicate that there should be a responsible chain of human command and control. This, I think, is as a standard to be as a desirable standard. I think this is uncontested, but I think it does seem to avoid the many or evade actually the many real problems of accountability that you encounter in this field. Because once you, I mean, the core issue is, of course, that once you delegate central decision-making authority to an AI system, it's very, I mean, you might end up in a situation where human beings are left off the hook. So this is the first dimension, but I think this becomes a more problem. I mean, the problem becomes thicker and harder to solve once you introduce additional factors, and one being the fact that you do have here really a very complex chain of decision making processes and decision makers which are involved in the end result, which is that the machine eventually applied lethal force, or the machine provided a data set that resulted in a human being applying lethal force. And I think you have here many human beings who were involved in the process. You have a programmer, you have a developer, you have an arms salesperson, you have a military purchaser, you have a commander that actually decided to deploy a weapon system in a certain theater of hostilities. You have a specific commander which authorized the actual use, and you may have even an operator which actually oversees the work of the system, but no one actually has the overall picture of what is the system actually programmed to do, and what it is as a result expected to do in the specific terrain that it was actually activated in. And this, the fact that we do have a lot of, we have a long chain of decision makers without anyone actually understanding the full implications of deploying a system, which again, we have to assume that that the operators do not fully grasp, or that the human beings involved in the chain do not all of them fully grasp the machine. And I think the problem becomes even more serious once you move from simple AI to also machines that deploy machine learning and deep learning, and thus becoming more farther removed from the data and the program that was put originally. You end up in spaces where you do have accountability vacuum if you apply conventional, for instance, criminal law concepts, which do require not only significant contribution towards the commission of a crime, but also moral responsibility, which is at least knowledge-based. And this is, I think, something which the structure of military AI, given the complexity and given the lack of transparency and given the delegation of authority to a machine, this is, I think, is a real serious problem. Add to that problems that are already very difficult to solve within a military context, which is command responsibility. How do you actually impose legal responsibility, not on the direct perpetrator, but on the. I think we need to mute those who are not speaking. So how do you actually impose responsibility not only on the soldier that operates the AI system, but actually commanders and the whole chain of command? So you do operate in areas which are very inhospitable for the application of traditional notions of responsibility, at least in the criminal sense. Now, we do mention in the article that there is also a state responsibility avenue. You could also say that the state is responsible, but there I think you do have real practical problems in the sense that we know that it's very hard to get states to accept responsibility, to make reparations, almost impossible to bring legal cases against states because of the structure of the various mechanisms of adjudication in this field of international humanitarian law. Maybe human rights is an avenue, but even there, it's going to be very hard to identify a deviation from a reasonable commander standard when you know relatively little about what the commander knew or should have known in the specific battleground terrain. I think I'll stop here. Maybe Yahli, you want to add a few concluding remarks, and then we open it for questions.
Just on this last point, I think that at least for me, state responsibility is a more reasonable avenue for responsibility in terms of autonomous weapons, right? There is all of the problems that you've mentioned are real problems. However, I do think that the problems associated with criminal responsibility are much more serious here regarding the mental element. And I think that it is at least possible to think about developing institutional avenues for responsibility in these contexts. And this is, I think, in terms of lawmaking, an easier path than the alternative path.
Thank you very much, Yahli and Yuval. We will now open the floor for discussion, questions, and comments. If anyone wants to participate, please indicate so in the chat or raise your hand.
Can you stop share, Yahli? Sorry.
So Tomer will be first. Please, Tomer.
Okay, thank you. So I'm really interested in your work, and it's a continuous debate between us. I teach law and ethics class in Tel Aviv University for computer science students, and each year Yuval coming to have a lecture on autonomous weapons. So I want to continue our discussion in this issue, and I want to challenge the framing of the question of who is better, AI or human in decision making? Because I think the framing of the question is wrong from several reasons. First, the technology right now is not mature yet. So there is no way to ask it. You can ask like in the future, maybe, but not now. And there is no way to check it out because it's really problematic to try, for example, autonomous car in the field. But trying autonomous weapon in the field is something that we don't want to do first. But it's more than that, because there is no like AI. It's depend on the context, which kind of decision, and which kind, who develop it, in which, according to which data, and which presumption, and a lot of questions. So I don't see any thing that come out from these questions. And if we like put away all this fantasy and romantic thinking about AI, now AI is machine learning, and machine learning, it's like a method, like family of method for having insight and finding patterns in big data. And asking whether this kind of methods is better than human, I don't think it's important question. And I think because the technology is not mature yet, we have a real opportunity not to ask those questions, but try to create or design guidelines for how to develop such technology. In which area, yes, and in which area not, according to which principles, because we are not like coming to the field after the technology, but during the technology is developing right now. So I think, and it's extremely important in the military issues because of question of life and death. So we have the opportunity right now to ask how to design such a system. And I think those kind of the question we should ask right now, and not whether in some day in the future, which kind of decision making is better, but asking how to develop the decision making of machine in order that it will assist human in those kind of decisions.
Okay, let me start, Yahli, and then you take up, because as Tomer said, this is an ongoing discussion. So I feel that we're continuing conversation. So the first answer is they started, of course, okay? I mean, the context against which the discussion currently takes place is against a public campaign against killer robots, okay? Which calls to introduce a moratorium on the development of these systems. So it's not about how we get better systems. There is a strong political push, which is supported by some states, to outlaw the development of such systems. Okay, and the argument is that these systems are not as good as human beings, okay? So they're morally problematic, but there is also a utilitarian argument which is made that they are going to produce more casualties on the battlefield because they don't understand what is proportionality, they don't understand context, they don't have compassion. And I think that at least on the first dimension is an ethical one, and I will get back to that momentarily. But the second argument, I think, does invite a certain degree of comparison. And here, at least what we are saying, that there is no reason to believe that machines would be, when deployed, and I will say something about what happened when deployed, that they would necessarily reach decisions which are less protective of humanitarian standards than human beings, because, for instance, they can be programmed not to kill any collateral damage. Okay, this is something you can do with a machine, because a machine can assume risks which you would not expect human soldiers to take, for instance. They're more expendable. Now, if we are right, and actually the path forward is that machines would take better decisions than humans, then there may be a legal obligation to develop these machines. Okay, because they would reduce, this is the IHL, this is the main ethos of IHL, is to reduce human suffering, is to reduce civilian casualties. So by saying, so I think the actual question of the comparison is actually very important to understand whether it's legally permissible or even legally required to develop the technology. So this is first stage. Second, I think there is really, we are really talking about a spectrum of meaningful human control. And the fact that we do not have killer robots, okay, I'm using the colloquial sense on the field, but we already have a lot of information which is generated by machines, which results in individuals being killed. Okay, and the most dramatic expression is the use of patterns of life analysis by with regard to US drones in Pakistan, which basically on the basis of certain criteria can identify an individual as a militant, and that piece of data results in that individual being killed. Now, it's true that the actual killing is done by a human being or by a drone operated by a human being and not by the machine itself. But in terms of the actual control, I think we are already very, very proximate to where we're at. And I think there you really have to question whether the quality, you really can question the quality. Now, in terms of whether this is deployed, it is already being deployed in some limited sense. We do have the Harpoon system, which is an Israeli kamikaze drone, which has already been deployed by Azerbaijan in the recent war last year against Armenia. It is a drone that is programmed to identify radar systems and to crash and burn on those radar systems. But you could say this is just a sophisticated torpedo missile that has been around for. So in terms of the distance from where we are from actually introducing lethal weapons in the battlefield, I don't think that the distance is as large as you represent, at least in very specific contexts. Okay, I agree that we do not have at this point in time the robot that would go into the field and actually identify individuals and use although Israel and Iran also already applied also in a non-military context, also used an automated submachine gun fire in order to assassinate a scientist. But I'm not sure that, I think conceptually we're not so far, because lethal force is applied on the basis of AI data generated recommendations, and we already have systems which are operational and are already deployed, and are AI that do not operate with human intervention. But you're right in very specific contexts. Yahli, you want to? Oh, sorry.
No, just I want to sharpen my point that I think that we don't need to ask which is better, but rather how to design those systems in order that they will be better, if we agree what is better. And then we should ask we should shape the legal rules in order to oblige the developer, the user to use those kind of system and not others. So I think we need to see how we craft the rules in order them to be better in what we think is better, and not to ask the deterministic question, what is better?
Well, I tend to agree with everything that Yuval said, but I just maybe re-emphasize that your suggestion actually follows, I think, to a large extent, the approach that Yuval presented, but the actual debate here in international is quite different, and it discussed the limits on the development of these systems. Just as one example, the ICRC published a few months ago their approach regarding autonomous weapons, suggesting that there should be a ban on the development of autonomous weapons that are designed to kill human beings. So in this sense, the debate actually happens around these areas. And I just maybe two things. First, I want to go back to the ethos of IHL, and I think that here an important thing is that life of death questions go both ways, right? Because the IHL operates in a far from ideal environment in which many people unfortunately lose their lives, and therefore a consequentialist position regarding the design of the law of war is right, a serious considerations in these debates, hoping for the least harmful result, and accepting many compromises along the way. And I think that it reflects many IHL rules that are in fact compromises that are not accepted in other areas of law. And the second is that I think that an important aspect of the debates over autonomous weapons and new technologies in war, and more generally, is the issue of fear from technology. And I really fear new technology. And I often notice how it shapes my positions regarding these debates, and you can see in the general debate that the concerns regarding these developments take a much more prominent role in the general debate, and you can see it in the positions that are submitted to, for example, in our context, to the GGE laws by various actors, in which the concerns regarding the developments of these technologies take a much more prominent role than the potential maybe improvement to the current state of affairs. And there are some states who suggest along the ways of what Yuval mentioned, that these technologies might reduce suffering in warfare, but this is only a very limited part of the debate.
Just last sentence, that I think that we have, like, in one side the fear of technology, and the other side, like, falling in love with technology, like robot will kill us and robot will save us. And we need to be very, very accurate in how to see the technology. And I think I really like in the beginning that you said that everybody speak about killer robots, but the military use of AI is much, much broader. And I think it will be really interesting to see the mapping, the typology of all these kind of use, and to see how to draw the legal lines around them, and not just to speak about this killer robot, which I think it's important debate, but it's not the whole debate. So I really like this line of thinking of yours. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the discourse. Our next question will be from Joanna Wilson, which is a researcher in wartime AI from Glasgow Center for International Law and Security. So welcome, Joanna, and please.
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you for the presentation and the article which you said. I agree an awful lot with everything that's been said by all three speakers so far. I think a lot when we broaden the discussion beyond laws, beyond autonomous weapons, towards all the military uses of AI, I think our sort of vision of AI can change to an extent that we almost move away from thinking about the technology even making a decision. I think we attribute an awful lot of agency to a machine that has still been powered by a human being to do what the human being wants it to do. And I think if we maybe similarly a bit, either the fear or the kind of the fetishizing of the technology might be diluted a little bit if we think of the machine as a tool for human agency, rather than if we stop thinking about decisions being delegated to machines. Because, and you talked about this in the chapter that you sent, that if we chart, how weapons have been from the start, we've always been trying to use technology, whether it's a longbow or something, to distance ourselves and risk on one side versus less on the other, and using technology to the extent at what point is the technology making the decision, and at what point is it just enacting something that a human has chosen to do. But equally, I share that I'm a technophobe too, so I don't know, maybe there are too many of us technophobes researching this area, I'm not sure. So maybe I'm too concerned about that, but trying to be as balanced as possible. If we try and almost accept there's maybe less power in the machine than we might think. And I think if we speak to computer scientists and things like that, I don't know about your experience, Tomer, I tend to see that they almost, the scientists who know the technology more than I do, for example, as a lawyer, as an international politics student, maybe they believe in the technology a little bit less than than we might, because we don't know its power.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think that goes in the direction of Tomer, that you shouldn't really cluster everything together, and you should actually break down, and maybe that would be a good project going forward to do a much more detailed analysis of different weapon systems and different decision-making contexts which invite the application. So this is really the traceability element that we mentioned before. I would, however, take some issue with the point about humans being in control in a complex military organization. I think so. It's not only, we often, it's one thing to talk about the technology and, we follow these navigation systems, and you can ask yourself whether I'm going to take the recommendation or not. And we have decision-making biases in this regard, and we do have automation biases. So I think even in this one-on-one interaction, we do, although, you could argue that the machine controls us to some extent, okay? And that we have delegated, in effect, some decision-making to machine in some context. So I wouldn't get rid of this. I think in the military context, it's even more difficult because of the complex nature of the organization and the division of labor between different decision-making sources. And I think it is actually very difficult for someone down the chain, in the example we gave before, the fighter pilot, to actually trace to what extent the information that was given to him or her was generated by an individual or a machine. It simply fits in a very complex and not completely, and certainly not non-trans. So you could say that there is a black box within the black box. Okay, so the machine operates within a larger black box of how do complex organizations take decisions. And I think that this exacerbates some of the problems. And I fear that there would be circumstances such as the question of facial recognition or patterns of life, where effectively the decision that was taken by a machine would be carried out. Now you could say rightly, Joanna, that individuals did make a decision to construct a decision-making process that its outcome would be determined by a machine output. So there is always an individual in the background that I would accept, but it would be very hard in terms of applying notions of responsibility, of legal responsibility for specific outcomes on the individuals that designed this opaque systems. So that's, I think, the concern for me.
Well, I think that the problem that Yuval described is broader than technology or AI. It applies to any complex structure of decision making. And I think that actually it's really interesting that AI in military settings compares to think more broadly about decision making in the military. So take, for example, an intelligence officer that provides information for a commander on the field. Does the commander of the field really have an informed decision whether to target a specific target? And I think that in this sense, at least there's a beginning of a change in the thinking about IHL, which was traditionally primarily focused on the commander in the field or the individual soldier, to think about it more broadly. And I think that Asaf has a paper about responsibility in the context of intelligence decision making. And there again, I think that you can face similar problems to those that you described. Yeah.
Thank you. I suppose the question is, are these kind of difficulties of chain of command and decision-making locations, is that an especially new problem that we're dealing with now? Or is that same issue but is it being applied to a new technology and a new way of conducting military operations? Or is it something that's so new and intrinsic to this thing that we're talking about today
Внимание, ваша сладкая...
Скажем вместе, сука, блядь. Работает синусоидеров, гордо спел и слушал указания.
Привет, я Даша, я корейка, и я люблю только веселье.
Ладно, когда так слать
Понесу куда пятикантов на мне мобильный костюм, это гангстер, бомбили не вся моя банда, я поебал и съебал в эту планку. Понесу куда пятикантов на мне мобильный костюм, это гангстер, бомбили не вся моя банда, я поебал и съебал в эту
Okay. Did I miss anyone else? Anyone else we need to throw out of the meeting? No. Okay, so apologies for that music recreational playing. We removed the problematic profiles. Hopefully,
this was definitely my fault. I admitted them, so take full responsibility.
Daphna, you wanted to ask a question before the music intermission?
I did. Sorry, I have no, it's fine. Yes, I wanted to ask a question. Okay, so thank you first of all for the paper, and I think that in recent years we see more and more academic literature that proposes a shift towards incorporating human rights dimension in the life cycle of AI technology, to shift to the by design approach. And one of the reasons is that, as you said, that even when there is a human in the loop, it's doubtful how meaningful that decision is, because we tend to trust the machine and because of the dynamic situation, etc. But my question is, I mean, when we are talking about IHL, so the problem is not only epistemological, it's also a moral and ethical, many moral and ethical decisions that the machine basically needs to make. And also the setting is very dynamic, and it's such that you cannot really expect in advance. And so, first of all, how do you, when you think about incorporating human rights in design, how do you overcome the epistemological problem, and how do you deal with the issue of the self-development of the AI, meaning that you cannot expect how the machine would develop, how the product would develop eventually. And also, and this also touches in the specific issue of IHL, how do you overcome the classification problem? The fear that the law is not going to evolve or develop with time, because we're going to insert certain too hard principles in the design of the AI.
Can you say again explain again the classification question?
Yeah, the fear is that the product or the machine is, that the law would not be able to evolve and develop because we design it a priorically, and so it's impossible to develop the law when we shift to a machine.
Okay, so before I answer you, I think we still owe Joanna an answer to the question before we had some nice music. And that is, yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, what we were talking about is typical of all complex organizations. I think the introduction of AI introduces another level of opacity and lack of transparency. And I think this is a deeper argument. I mean, this is a more fundamental point, which I don't know if we have time to discuss, but I think the what we're actually seeing when humans interact with machines is actually the interaction affects both parties, in the sense that machines learn to think like humans, but humans learn to think and operate like machines. So I think the introduction of a machine into the chain of decision making does encourage, encourage certain tendencies of adopting binary decisions by individuals, so as to allow for the integration of the machine into the decision making process. I think we are actually seeing this now in a very unrelated context in COVID, where you do have actually now the government is publishing these decision-making trees, where if you have these symptoms, you go to this. If you have to this, so it really looks like a computerized decision-making. And I think this is also already happening and will increasingly happen in a complex organizational context such as the military. With regard to your points, Daphna, the epistemological issue, can they really know and understand? I mean, well, we don't know. As Tomer said, we haven't really tested this in real life. There is no reason to expect that if they cannot, play very complex strategy games and can drive vehicles in human traffic and make relevant distinctions along these lines, that technologically it would be impossible to teach machines to operate in somewhat chaotic environments. Of course, it may be the case that both sides have machines, and then maybe the environment would be somewhat less chaotic, like a Star Wars.
Not necessarily.
Sorry?
Not necessarily less chaotic.
Well, maybe. But the point you raised about predictability is very important. And I think in terms of developing the field normatively, I mean, there has to be even if not in control in real time, what you must have is some ex post facto supervision, which is able to basically understand document what happened, analyze what happened, and then if one is talking about a process of learning and updating, there has to be a process of learning and updating, and that may also go to the other question about ossification, or the way in which the law could be upgraded. And I mean, we've seen this with technology, that you do have different generations, so 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, and each generation could have its own its own set of rules. I mean, this is actually could be a good reason why you update the laws of war, because you're coming out with a new model of an AI system. Yahli, what do you think?
Just regarding this last point, I think that one strong argument against the formal lawmaking path is this rapid changing of technology that suggests that maybe software guidelines are more adaptable to address this reality and allow the law in general, and specifically IHL, to adapt to the reality of fast evolving technologies.
Thank you very much, Yahli and Yuval. Apologies again for the bad music taste. We could have hoped for a better attack. We have another question by Lior, a recent joiner of our center. Please, Lior.
Yes, thank you for a fascinating talk. I just wonder how
the Russian hackers.
You just got it. Okay, now can you hear me? It was a bit stuck.
Now we can.
Okay,
Now we can.
I just wanted to ask how the applications of those AI systems in our decision-making processes in complex organizations can affect other accountability mechanisms that the IHL has. For instance, the command responsibility there is in IHL. I mean, how can we? Yes, can you hear me? Okay. How can we see a commander as accountable for an action that the algorithm has made? Or I mean, how do we understand who can be held accountable in those instances if this organization is so complex and if we're leaning on such processes that we don't know how to explain?
Yeah, there were some suggestions, I think, in the literature to solve the problems associated with the mental element in criminal responsibility through the notion of command responsibility, which allows a more lenient mental element. However, I think that we both share the position that command responsibility isn't really, widens the notion too much to look at AI systems as subordinates of commanders in the military.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Yahli. I think command responsibility assumes that there has been a crime. There has been a violation which qualifies as a crime at the end of the chain of command. So if there is no one has committed a crime, it's very hard to apply command responsibility. Failure to prevent or to punish a crime. That's the key. Joint criminal enterprise that for some time didn't have its heyday in international criminal law would have been perhaps an interesting avenue here, a more interesting avenue here, because joint criminal enterprise does the theory of joint criminal enterprise does accept that in complex organizations, actually there is no single individual that has the full actus reus et mens rea elements, but the organization as a whole may actually generate a conduct which constitutes a crime, and therefore it is enough for you to share the general aim of the enterprise and be aware to the direction and make a significant contribution to it, that you'll be held accountable. But as some of you know, I mean, the ICC has essentially rejected JCE as a basis for responsibility. So I'm not sure that this is this is really available at this point in time.
But sorry, just to follow up. But if a crime has been committed, and crime was based on those decision-making processes, I mean, how can we hold someone accountable? I mean, obviously, we need to find some solution to this, and this is quite a. I mean, this scenario is plausible. Crimes can be committed through this process. I mean, I think that this question has to be regarded, and if we don't use those doctrines, I mean, how can we address this issue? It would be quite easy gateway to criminals, to war criminals, or the perpetrators of crimes against humanity, etc.
I think you're right. This is why we have a problem of accountability. I mean, there are some discussions in the periphery of the literature about whether, to what extent you have criminal command responsibility over crimes committed by individuals that do not carry criminal responsibility, such as children, okay? So I think you can maybe draw some analogies, but this is a very peripheral part of international criminal law. I think, in any way, I think the problem here is more fundamental, that you do not have individuals who actually incur the full moral responsibility for what has happened. And I think this is really, and even the commanders, they only have part of the picture. And there is also issue of, like was asked before by Daphna, of predictability. So they don't really anticipate what's going to happen. So if they're guilty of something, it would probably be negligence, but negligence is a very limited ground for responsibility in ICL. It applies even in the command responsibility avenue. It does, again, assume that the crime was committed, and also requires that there has been reason to know. So you need, it's not enough that you're negligent, you need to show something more.
I think that your question touches upon the heart of the debate over autonomous weapons, right? There are serious concerns about various issues, primarily those that Yuval discussed, the notion of meaningful human control and responsibility. And there are no easy solutions for these problems. And you need to assess, when you think about the legality of such weapons, whether the potential benefit of using these weapons, for example, by significantly reducing suffering in warfare, overweights the extremely challenging questions regarding responsibility. And I think that where you stand in this regard will determines to a large extent your position regarding laws, because I do not think that there is an easy solution for the problem of responsibility. And as long as you think that, and especially that criminal responsibility is crucial for this notion of conducting warfare, maybe you lean towards banning these weapons. I do think, at least for me, that you know, the fact that normally criminal law applies to these situations is not satisfactory, in the sense that we know that criminal responsibility is something that actually in the real world happens only in very limited occasions. So we have it on paper, but in fact, if actual accountability is something that is not a common phenomenon, maybe the potential benefits of these systems do outweigh the price that we pay in terms of responsibility.
Thank you very much, Yuval and Yahli. If I can add one last question before we wrap up, I'm curious to know if you think that an issue which is worth considering is also power imbalance or power disparities between states. Weapons are used as a leverage, as a tool in the relations between states, and unlike a rifle, when you export, for example, a program or AI, sometimes you can manage, regulate, shut it down from a distance, making a shift basically in the relations or in the ability to exert influence by one side on another. And since in cyberspace the issue of imbalance, equality in access to the chain supply, and etc., is of relevance, and it is something which is discussed in between states, especially in OWEG. So I'm curious to know, do you think that it is worth noting, thinking of, considering in this kind of a project?
Yahli, why don't you start?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that right, there are two parts to the answer. First, that regarding new technologies, the facts are always something that is interesting, right? In what way will it affect power balances, right? Is cyber actually a weapon of the weak, or does it give more power to powerful nations? And I think that that at least in the paper we do touch upon the issue of power differences, and we give I think a nuanced answer in this regard, because I think that first, no new technology really changes significantly the balance of powers between weak and powerful states, right? Think about the US and Luxembourg, right? Even without AI or anything, right? Clearly, we know what will happen if, unfortunately, they will have some kind of armed conflict between the two. And here I think that the two most important things are, A, will these technologies incentivize states or powerful states to use force more easily? And I think that there is a good reason to think that it will, because, and it's not only AI, it's remote warfare more generally, right? When you can use a drone from thousands of kilometers of distance, really limiting the risk to your own soldiers, there's a strong incentive to use force in these situations. And I think that we do see this type of things in recent decades. But on the other hand, there is, I think, a challenging question regarding within accepting that the conflict already exists, whether these technologies reduce civilian harm to weaker parties or increase it. And I think again that the answer is not easy, right? Because on the one hand, you can use, I don't know, precision guided munitions or autonomous weapons in ways that in a specific attack limit the number of casualties. But on the other hand, if you can always justify every attack, suggesting, right, like think about the conflict in Gaza, every attack where it complies with the rules because it was a precision guided munitions and only a limited number of civilians were hit, it allows again these powerful states to use force on more occasions without the danger of violating the black letter of IHL, and thus in the aggregate leading to more suffering of weaker parties. And I think that there are good arguments to both sides.
Maybe just adding, I mean, the point Yahli just made is what Sam Moyn in his book on humane actually makes, that wars have become more humane in the eyes of decision makers, and I think technology is a big part of that story. That it's all more, it's distant, no body bags, and it's scientific. Okay, we program the machine to generate fewer casualties, and therefore there is no problem. Okay, this is, and that feeds on the public's perception of technology. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting and Yahli is right. It's a general point. If you look at weapon regulation, the rule of thumb is that if everyone has it, then it may be regulated. If only few countries have it, then it would not be regulated. So that's the difference between chemical weapon and nuclear weapon. Okay. Chemical weapon everyone has, therefore everyone has an interest to regulate. No one has an advantage in keeping it. And the game is only whether you're cheating or not. When you're talking about something which is only some have access to at this point in time, there would be no incentive for regulation. And this is why even the process that we are seeing is generating very open-ended and watered down standards.
Thank you very much. So, unless I missed anyone, we have reached the end of our Q&A. I want to thank Yuval and Yahli for the presentation and discussion. This is the last session for the current semester. We will publish in a few weeks our schedule for the next semester, and we'll also send our newsletter, which summarizes the activities in the recent months. Thank you very much for everyone. Apologies again for any inconvenience. If anyone was heard by the music or the writings in the chat, we take full responsibility. So until next time, and in the spirit of our attackers, spasiba. Goodbye.
Bye.